The fog of war hung thick in the pre-dawn darkness as Commander Joseph Rochefort shook himself awake, his tired eyes straining to focus on the luminous dial of his wristwatch. 4:30 in the morning, December 19th, 1942. Around him, hundreds of sailors were already stirring from their bunks aboard the vessels of the United States Pacific Fleet anchored in Pearl Harbor. The metallic clang of booted feet on ladder wells echoed through the steel corridors of warships as men made their way to battle stations in the darkness. No one had expected to be awake at this ungodly hour 6 months earlier. But that was before Admiral Chester Nimitz had made the controversial decision that would ultimately reshape the nature of naval warfare in the Pacific theater. Rochefort splashed cold water on his face and quickly dressed. The bitter taste of Navy coffee, his third cup since waking, lingered on his tongue as he gathered his notes. In just 15 minutes, he was expected at the Combat Intelligence Center, known unofficially as the Dungeon, where he and his team of codebreakers worked tirelessly to intercept and decipher Japanese naval communications. As he hurried across the still dark base, the silhouettes of mighty warships loomed against the faint pre-dawn glow on the horizon. He passed scores of sailors already at their morning stations, running equipment checks, monitoring radar, and preparing the fleet's ships and aircraft for potential combat operations. The discipline was evident, even if the grumbling about the early réveillé had never fully subsided. The sharp smell of fuel oil mixed with salt air filled his nostrils as Rochefort paused momentarily, watching a squadron of Wildcat fighters being readied on the flight deck of a carrier. Their engines would roar to life in less than 30 minutes, ready to provide the dawn combat air patrol that had become standard procedure since January. No one could have predicted how Admiral Nimitz's seemingly arbitrary command decision, forcing every sailor in the Pacific Fleet to begin their day at 4:30 in the morning, would become one of the most consequential yet unheralded decisions of the entire war in the Pacific. The date was January 7th, 1942. Chester William Nimitz had been Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet for exactly 1 week, having taken command on the last day of December, 1941. The 57-year-old Texan had inherited a devastated fleet and shattered morale following the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor just 1 month earlier. The wreckage of American battleships still protruded from the harbor's oily waters, a constant reminder of the worst naval disaster in American history. The USS Arizona lay where it had sunk, a tomb for over 1,000 sailors. The USS Oklahoma remained capsized, its keel pointed skyward. The USS California and USS West Virginia sat partially submerged in the shallow harbor. Everywhere Nimitz looked, he saw physical evidence of a military catastrophe unprecedented in American history. Yet it was not just the material damage that concerned the new commander. It was the psychological wound inflicted on the entire naval service. The proud Pacific Fleet, once the embodiment of American naval power, had been caught utterly unprepared. Officers avoided making eye contact, ashamed of their collective failure. Enlisted men moved about their duties with a mechanical detachment, as if sleepwalking through their assignments. The atmosphere of defeat hung over Pearl Harbor as persistently as the smoke that had finally cleared from the December 7th attack. Nimitz had been born on February 24, 1885, in the small German-American settlement of Fredericksburg, Texas. The limestone house where he entered the world still stood on Main Street, attached to the steamboat-shaped Nimitz Hotel operated by his grandfather. The son of a hotel owner, young Chester grew up without his father, who died before his birth. Raised by his mother and grandfather, a former seaman in the German merchant marine, Nimitz developed an early appreciation for discipline, self-reliance, and the sea. His grandfather's stories of naval adventure sparked a passion that would shape his entire life. The elder Nimitz, who had commanded sailing ships in the North Sea, instilled in his grandson a deep understanding of maritime traditions and the special brand of leadership required at sea. The sea is unforgiving of mistakes, his grandfather would tell him. A captain must anticipate danger before it becomes visible. These lessons would serve Chester Nimitz well in the decades to come, particularly in the darkest days following Pearl Harbor. At 16, Nimitz set his sights on the United States Military Academy at West Point. When no appointments were available, he took the examination for Annapolis instead. In 1901, despite lacking a high school diploma, he was accepted to the United States Naval Academy, where he graduated 7th in his class of 114 midshipmen. His early naval career revealed an officer of exceptional intelligence and steady temperament. Fellow officers described the young Nimitz as unflappable and methodical, qualities that would later define his leadership in crisis. An incident early in his career demonstrated both his calm under pressure and his willingness to accept responsibility. As a young ensign commanding the destroyer USS Decatur, Nimitz ran the vessel aground in Manila Bay. At his subsequent court-martial, he took full responsibility for the error, making no excuses. This straightforward acceptance of accountability impressed his superiors, who noted that Nimitz would exercise more care in the future. The incident, rather than derailing his career, became a formative experience that shaped his leadership philosophy. By 1917, as America entered World War I, Lieutenant Commander Nimitz was already making his mark as an innovator in naval operations. As Chief of Staff to the Commander of the Atlantic Fleet's submarine force, he pioneered techniques for underway refueling that would later prove crucial in the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean. His technical expertise with diesel engines earned him an assignment overseeing the conversion of submarine propulsion systems from gasoline to diesel, a change that significantly enhanced submarine safety and capability. Nimitz's experience with submarines gave him a unique perspective on naval warfare. Submariners lived with constant danger, operating complex machinery in an inherently hostile environment where a small mistake could be fatal. The submarine service fostered a culture of meticulous preparation, constant vigilance, and respect for the unforgiving nature of the sea, values that Nimitz would later instill throughout the Pacific Fleet. Between the wars, Nimitz's career continued its upward trajectory. He commanded the cruiser USS Augusta, flagship of the Asiatic Fleet, and served as Assistant Chief of the Bureau of Navigation. While commanding Augusta, he had observed firsthand the rising power of Imperial Japan, noting with concern the increasing militarization of Japanese society and the growing capability of the Japanese Navy. He developed a profound respect for Japanese naval prowess, a respect that would prevent him from underestimating his adversary when war finally came. In 1939, as war clouds gathered over Europe, Nimitz was appointed Chief of the Bureau of Navigation, a crucial administrative post responsible for naval personnel management. It was from this position that President Franklin D. Roosevelt summoned him to assume command of the Pacific Fleet following Pearl Harbor. The president's selection surprised many, as Nimitz was not the most senior admiral available. But Roosevelt, with his deep knowledge of naval affairs, recognized in Nimitz the combination of technical expertise, administrative skill, and unflappable temperament needed to rebuild a shattered fleet while simultaneously preparing for offensive operations. When Nimitz arrived in Hawaii on Christmas Day, 1941, he found a naval command in disarray. The psychological impact of the December 7th attack had been nearly as devastating as the material losses. The once proud Pacific Fleet had been caught completely unaware. Battleships sunk, aircraft destroyed on the ground, and over 2,000 American servicemen killed. Perhaps worst of all was the sense of shame and humiliation that permeated the surviving officer corps. The smell of burning oil still lingered in the air as Nimitz's seaplane touched down in Pearl Harbor. From the air he had seen the terrible evidence of the Japanese attack, the capsized hulls, the oil slicks, the blackened superstructures of once mighty battleships. But it was the faces of the men who greeted him that told the more troubling story. These were sailors and officers who had experienced not just defeat, but humiliation on a scale unprecedented in American naval history. Rear Admiral William Pye, who had temporarily assumed command after Admiral Husband Kimmel's relief, greeted Nimitz at the submarine base. Rather than hold the change of command ceremony aboard a battleship, as tradition dictated, Nimitz was forced to raise his flag above the submarine USS Grayling. Every battleship in the harbor had either been sunk or damaged beyond immediate repair. The same thing could have happened to anyone, Nimitz kindly told the disgraced Admiral Kimmel upon taking command. But privately, he was determined that such a catastrophe would never happen again on his watch. During his first week as Commander-in-Chief, Nimitz methodically assessed the situation, meeting with surviving staff officers, visiting damaged ships, and inspecting the harbor defenses. He was particularly disturbed by reports of how completely the Japanese had achieved tactical surprise. What troubled him most was not the damage itself, ships could be repaired or replaced, new aircraft could be built, but rather the fundamental failure in readiness that had allowed the attack to succeed so spectacularly. Reports indicated that despite rising tensions with Japan, the Pacific Fleet had maintained peacetime routines right up to the moment of the attack. Anti-aircraft batteries had been unmanned, ammunition had been locked away, radar warnings had been misinterpreted or ignored, and perhaps most crucially, the fleet had been at its lowest state of readiness during the dawn hours when it was most vulnerable. The Japanese attack had begun at 7:55 on a Sunday morning, a time deliberately chosen to catch American forces at their lowest state of readiness. Most officers had been ashore. Many sailors were still asleep or just beginning their day. The fleet had been at Condition 3 readiness with only minimal watchstanders on duty. No patrol aircraft had been airborne, and radar warnings had been misinterpreted or ignored. The result had been a massacre. As Nimitz pored over the after-action reports in his temporary headquarters, a pattern emerged that he found deeply troubling. The Japanese had not just exploited a momentary lapse in vigilance, they had targeted a systemic weakness in American naval operations. The Pacific Fleet, operating on peacetime routines despite the growing threat of war, had been most vulnerable in the early morning hours. And the Japanese, with their meticulous intelligence gathering, had known exactly when to strike. On January 7, 1942, Admiral Nimitz called his senior commanders to a meeting in his new headquarters at the submarine base. Present were his operations officer, intelligence officer, and the commanders of air, surface, and submarine forces. The mood was somber as the men assembled, expecting yet another review of the Pearl Harbor disaster and its implications for future operations. Instead, Nimitz surprised them with a radical new directive. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice calm but resolute, "effective immediately, all personnel in the Pacific Fleet will commence their duty day at 0430 hours, without exception." The room fell silent. The only sound was the distant hum of generators and the occasional call of a boatswain's pipe from a nearby ship. Captain William Smith, Nimitz's chief of staff, cleared his throat. "Sir, may I ask the reasoning behind such an early réveillé?" Nimitz nodded. "You may, Captain. The reasoning is straightforward. The Imperial Japanese Navy believes they understand our patterns, our habits, and our weaknesses. They exploited those patterns on December 7th with devastating effect. We will not give them that opportunity again." Nimitz stood and walked to a large map of the Pacific that dominated one wall of the conference room. The vast blue expanse, dotted with tiny islands, underscored the enormous challenge facing the American forces. Despite the devastating blow at Pearl Harbor, the United States still had to defend a geographic area encompassing millions of square miles with a fleet that had been crippled in a single morning. The Japanese attacked at dawn because they expected us to be unprepared. They were correct. But I intend to make that their last correct assumption about this fleet. Captain Edwin Layton, the fleet intelligence officer, nodded slowly as he grasped the Admiral's reasoning. "You want the entire fleet at general quarters before dawn, every day?" "Precisely, Captain," replied Nimitz. The Japanese will undoubtedly attempt another surprise attack. When they do, they will find every ship fully manned, every aircraft ready to launch, every radar actively scanning, and every sailor at his battle station. Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, commander of the fleet's carrier task forces, frowned. His weathered face, tanned by years of service at sea, creased with concern. Admiral, with all due respect, maintaining that level of readiness indefinitely will be exhausting for the men. We're talking about cutting into their already limited rest time by at least 2 hours every day. Our carriers are operating with skeleton crews as it is. The men are working around the clock to maintain aircraft and train new pilots. Nimitz acknowledged the concern with a nod. I understand the burden this will place on our personnel, Admiral Fitch. But consider the alternative. The Japanese achieved total surprise once because we adhered to peacetime routines during wartime. Every sailor who died on December 7th paid the ultimate price for that complacency. I will not allow that to happen again. There were murmurs around the table, but no one could argue with Nimitz's logic. The faces of the assembled officers reflected a mixture of resignation and determination. They had all seen the devastating results of unpreparedness. None wanted to experience another Pearl Harbor. The Admiral continued, his voice taking on a steely edge. Additionally, gentlemen, this early reveille serves another crucial purpose. It sends a message to every man in this fleet that this is not the same Navy that was caught sleeping on December 7th. We are at war, and war demands sacrifice and vigilance. Commander Joseph Rochefort, head of the Combat Intelligence Unit responsible for breaking Japanese naval codes, spoke up. His tired eyes and rumpled uniform testified to the long hours he and his team had been working since the attack. Sir, my code breakers have been working around the clock since the attack. They're already exhausted. If we implement this policy, I'm concerned about their effectiveness. Nimitz fixed Rochefort with a thoughtful gaze. He respected the intelligence officer's concerns. The work of the codebreakers would prove crucial in the months ahead, as Nimitz well knew. Their ability to anticipate Japanese movements might make the difference between victory and defeat in the coming naval battles. Commander, I value the work of your cryptanalysts more than you know. Make whatever accommodations are necessary for your specialists. But the general policy stands. This fleet will be ready at all times, and that readiness begins before dawn. Rochefort nodded, already mentally rearranging the shifts for his overworked team. He understood the Admiral's intent, even if it would create logistical challenges for his specialized unit. As the meeting concluded, Captain Smith remained behind with Nimitz. The Chief of Staff, who had served with distinction in the pre-war Navy, had concerns of his own. "The men won't like it, Admiral," he said quietly. "Morale is already at rock bottom after Pearl Harbor. This might push them further." Nimitz smiled faintly. "I'm not asking them to like it, Bill. I'm asking them to survive this war, and to do that, we need to change how we think about naval readiness. The old peacetime Navy died on December 7th. This is the war Navy now, and it starts its day at 0430. Smith nodded, recognizing the wisdom in Nimitz's approach. The Pacific Fleet couldn't afford another disaster like Pearl Harbor. If that meant waking before dawn every day for the duration of the war, so be it. News of Admiral Nimitz's early reveille policy spread rapidly throughout the fleet, and as Captain Smith had predicted, it was not well received. For sailors accustomed to beginning their day at 6 or 6:30, the 4:30 wake-up call represented a jarring change to established routines. The grumbling was immediate and widespread. Aboard the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, which had fortunately been at sea during the Pearl Harbor attack, Seaman First Class James Thornton was among the many who questioned the wisdom of the new policy. The young sailor from Iowa had joined the Navy just 8 months earlier, attracted by recruiting posters promising adventure and a chance to see the world. Now, as he prepared his bunk for pre-dawn inspection, he found himself wondering if he had made the right choice. "We're already working 18-hour days," he confided to his bunkmate, as they folded blankets into tight regulation squares. "Now they want us up before the birds? The Japs won't attack every day at dawn. It's madness." His bunkmate, aviation machinist's mate Robert Jensen, nodded in agreement. A veteran of 3 years' service, Jensen had seen his workload triple since the war began. His hands bore the cuts and calluses of endless hours maintaining the complex engines of the carrier's aircraft. "My hands are already shaking from lack of sleep," he said, holding them out to demonstrate the tremor. "How am I supposed to maintain aircraft engines when I can barely keep my eyes open?" Similar conversations occurred throughout the fleet. In the cramped quarters of destroyers, the open berthing spaces of cruisers, and the vast hangar decks of carriers, sailors voiced their frustration with the new policy. Some saw it as an overreaction. Others questioned whether the admiral understood the practical challenges of implementing such a dramatic change in routine. Officers worried about maintaining crew efficiency with reduced rest. The ship's doctor aboard the cruiser USS San Francisco warned the captain that sleep deprivation would lead to increased accidents and illness. The human body wasn't designed to function on 4 hours of sleep, he argued. We're going to see a spike in mistakes, and mistakes at sea cost lives. Medical personnel predicted an increase in accidents and illness. Mess stewards complained about the logistical challenges of serving breakfast to thousands of sailors in the pre-dawn darkness. Engineering officers worried that reduced crew rest would lead to errors in the complex machinery spaces of their vessels. Yet despite the complaints, Admiral Nimitz stood firm. When a petition from junior officers reached his desk suggesting a more moderate approach, he called a fleet-wide radio address to explain his reasoning. On January 15, 1942, at 1600 hours, all ships in the Pacific Fleet were ordered to pipe the Admiral's message through their internal communication systems. "This is Admiral Nimitz, speaking to all hands in the Pacific Fleet," his calm voice crackled over shipboard loudspeakers. Across the harbor, on dozens of vessels, sailors paused in their duties to listen. "I understand that many of you are unhappy with the new 0430 Repelling. I don't blame you. It's early, it's dark, it's uncomfortable. But let me explain why this temporary hardship is necessary." Sailors throughout the fleet paused in their duties to listen as Nimitz continued. In the machine shop aboard the repair ship USS Medusa, Chief Machinist's mate Frank Dillard motioned for his men to stop their work so they could hear the Admiral's words. The rhythmic pounding of hammers and hiss of welding torches fell silent. The Imperial Japanese Navy believes they have our measure. They think they know when we sleep, when we eat, when we're vulnerable. They use that knowledge to devastating effect 1 month ago today. But they don't know the true measure of American sailors. They don't understand our capacity to adapt, to learn, and to overcome. Aboard the cruiser USS San Francisco, Chief Petty Officer William Harrison felt a chill as Nimitz's words resonated with him. He had lost his younger brother in the Pearl Harbor attack. Thomas Harrison had been a gunner's mate aboard the USS Arizona, one of the 1,177 men who went down with the battleship when Japanese bombs detonated its forward magazine. William had identified his brother's body, one of the few recovered from the sunken battleship. "This early reveille serves 3 critical purposes," Nimitz explained, his voice conveying both authority and understanding. "First, it ensures that every ship, every aircraft, and every sailor is fully alert and ready for combat during the most likely hours for a surprise attack. Second, it creates a new operational rhythm that the enemy cannot predict. And third, it reminds each of us every single day that we are at war. This is not a peacetime Navy anymore." There was a pause before the Admiral's voice returned, now with greater intensity. "I'm not asking you to maintain this schedule forever, but for now, while we rebuild our strength and prepare to take the fight to the enemy, I need every man in this fleet to demonstrate the discipline and determination that will ultimately bring us victory. That begins at 0430 every morning." The grumbling didn't stop entirely after Nimitz's address, but it diminished considerably. Many sailors, particularly those who had witnessed the devastation of December 7th firsthand, began to understand the Admiral's reasoning. The early Reveille became a symbol of the fleet's transformation from peacetime complacency to wartime vigilance. For Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of code breakers, the policy created both challenges and unexpected benefits. Working in an underground facility known as the Dungeon, Rochefort's cryptanalysts were responsible for breaking the Japanese naval code, known as JN-25. Their work required intense concentration and mental acuity, qualities that didn't always thrive on reduced sleep. The windowless concrete bunker where they worked was a world removed from the rhythms of daylight and darkness that regulated life above ground. The air inside was perpetually stale, heavy with cigarette smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. Rochefort himself rarely left the facility, sometimes working for days without returning to his quarters. He was known to wear the same bathrobe for days on end, catching brief naps at his desk between decoding sessions. Yet the early start to each day provided Rochefort's team with additional hours when radio traffic from the Japanese fleet was minimal. These quiet hours allowed them to catch up on backlogged intercepts and refine their code-breaking techniques without the constant interruption of new messages arriving. The pre-dawn shift became particularly valuable for this work, as Rochefort discovered that his team could often make greater progress during these uninterrupted hours than during the busier daytime periods. Moreover, the early Reveille created a natural synchronization between the code breakers and the operational commanders they served. With both groups beginning their day at the same early hour, intelligence assessments developed overnight could be delivered to command staff just as they arrived for duty, providing them with the freshest possible information for their daily decision-making. By early February 1942, just 1 month after implementation, Nimitz's 4:30 Reveille policy had become the new normal for the Pacific Fleet. Ships maintained condition to readiness, 1 step below general quarters, from 4:30 until full daylight each morning. All radars were fully manned, aircraft were prepped for immediate launch, and damage control teams stood ready. Anti-aircraft gunners remained at their stations, scanning the dawn skies for any sign of approaching enemy aircraft. The psychological impact of this routine was as significant as its tactical value. Sailors who began each day prepared for combat developed a constant state of vigilance that permeated all their activities. The sharp division between peacetime and wartime thinking had been eliminated. Every man in the fleet now lived with the constant awareness that combat could come at any moment, and this awareness shaped their approach to even the most routine duties. And then, on February 1st, 1942, it happened. At 5:15 in the morning, radar operators aboard the destroyer USS Helm detected a large formation of aircraft approaching from the northwest, approximately 100 miles from Pearl Harbor. The sky was still black, with only the faintest hint of dawn on the eastern horizon. Under the pre-Pearl Harbor routine, the radar station might not yet have been fully operational. But under Nimitz's early Reveille policy, the radar operators had been at their stations since 4:45, fully alert and scanning methodically. The operators, fully alert at their stations thanks to the early Reveille, immediately reported the contact to the Fleet Command Center. The duty officer there, Lieutenant Commander James Harper, had been awake since 4:15 and had already reviewed the night's intelligence summaries. He recognized immediately the potential significance of the radar contact. "Distance and bearing?" he demanded. 100 miles, bearing 290, sir," replied the radar operator. "Multiple contacts, appears to be a large formation, speed approximately 180 knots. Harper didn't hesitate. "Sound general quarters, all ships, all shore installations. Launch the ready cap. And get Admiral Nimitz on the line." Within minutes, Admiral Nimitz was awakened and briefed on the situation. He calmly ordered the fleet to general quarters and launched the KP, Combat Air Patrol fighters, that had been standing ready since 4:45. Unlike December 7th, there was no confusion, no delay, no disbelief that the Japanese would attack again. The insistent clanging of general quarters, alarm bells echoed across Pearl Harbor. Sailors who were already awake and at their duty stations moved swiftly to combat readiness positions. Those still in their bunks, a minority under the new routine, threw on their clothes and raced to their battle stations. The response was immediate and comprehensive. By 5:45, every ship in Pearl Harbor was at battle stations. Anti-aircraft crews tracked the incoming formation with their weapons. Fighters from the newly established shore-based air defense squadrons climbed to intercept the approaching aircraft. Hospital corpsmen prepared for casualties. Damage control parties stood by with firefighting equipment. The nervous tension was palpable as men waited at their stations, many silently acknowledging that the 4:30 Reveille they had cursed just days earlier might now save their lives. Nimitz himself stood in the Fleet Command Center, outwardly calm but inwardly alert to every development. This was the moment his early morning policy had been designed for. At 6:10, as the sun began to creep over the eastern horizon, the radar tracks unexpectedly changed course, turning west and beginning to separate. Puzzled operators maintained contact until the truth became clear. It wasn't a Japanese attack force at all, but rather a formation of American B-17 bombers arriving from the mainland United States. The pilots, unaware of the heightened alert status at Pearl Harbor, had not properly identified themselves upon approach. When the all-clear was sounded at 6:25, there was a collective exhale throughout the fleet. No shots had been fired, no actual threat had materialized. But the response had been everything Admiral Nimitz had hoped for: swift, coordinated, and comprehensive. Later that day, Nimitz gathered his senior staff to review the morning's events. The men filed into the conference room, their faces showing a mixture of relief and pride at how the fleet had responded to the perceived threat. "Gentlemen," he said, a rare smile crossing his normally serious face, "this morning was the best drill we could have hoped for. Every ship, every aircraft, every sailor responded exactly as they should have. Had that been an actual Japanese attack, the outcome would have been very different from December 7th. Captain Layton, the intelligence officer, nodded in agreement. The Japanese would have faced a fully alert fleet. Their losses would have been catastrophic. And that, Nimitz replied, is precisely the point of our 4:30 Reveille. The element of surprise now belongs to us, not to the enemy." Word of the false alarm and the fleet's rapid response spread quickly. For many sailors who had questioned the early wake-up policy, the incident provided concrete validation. What had seemed like an arbitrary hardship now revealed itself as a crucial tactical advantage. The grumbling about lost sleep didn't disappear entirely, but it was increasingly tempered by a growing appreciation for the Admiral's foresight. Seaman Thornton, who had been among the most vocal critics of the early Reveille, found himself revising his opinion. "I still hate getting up in the dark," he told his bunkmate, "but I'd rather be tired than dead." As weeks turned into months, the early Reveille policy evolved. Nimitz and his staff refined the protocol, creating a rotating schedule that maintained peak readiness during the most vulnerable pre-dawn hours, while allowing some sailors additional rest on a staggered basis. The core principle remained unchanged. The Pacific Fleet would never again be caught unprepared at dawn. The true test of Nimitz's early morning readiness doctrine came on April 18, 1942, when 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, launched from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet to conduct the first American air raid on the Japanese home islands. The daring raid, which struck Tokyo and several other Japanese cities, achieved minimal physical damage but delivered a powerful psychological blow to Japanese military leaders who had assured their people that the home islands were invulnerable to American attack. The Emperor himself had been forced to take shelter during the raid, shattering the myth of his divine protection from America's reach. The raid required extraordinary coordination and timing. The carrier task force had to approach within striking distance of Japan without being detected, launch aircraft that had never before taken off from a carrier deck, and then withdraw safely before the full might of the Japanese Navy could respond. The mission's success depended on absolute readiness at every level of the operation. The Hornet's crew, thoroughly conditioned to pre-dawn readiness by months of 4:30 réveillés, executed the complex launch operation flawlessly. Every man was at his station well before dawn, prepared for the historic mission. Deck crews had the bombers spotted and ready for launch. Flight deck officers had rehearsed the intricate ballet of launching 16 bombers from a carrier deck not designed for such large aircraft. The ship's engineers maintained precise speed and heading to create optimal wind over the deck for the heavily laden bombers. When the first B-25 thundered down the Hornet's deck and clawed its way into the air, it represented not just a technical achievement, but a triumph of the readiness doctrine Nimitz had established. The early réveillé policy had created a fleet capable of executing complex operations at dawn, the very time when the Japanese had expected them to be at their most vulnerable. The Japanese response to the Doolittle raid was swift and furious. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, accelerated plans for a decisive naval engagement aimed at destroying what remained of the American carrier force. This offensive would culminate in the Battle of Midway in early June, a pivotal clash that would change the course of the Pacific War. But before Midway, the Japanese attempted several smaller raids against American bases, including a pre-dawn airstrike against installations on Oahu on May 4, 1942. Launched from two carriers operating approximately 200 miles northwest of Hawaii, the Japanese strike package consisted of 36 Kate torpedo bombers and 27 Zero fighters. The raiders approached in the pre-dawn darkness, exactly as they had on December 7th. But this time, they encountered a very different reception. American radar operators, fully alert since 4:30, detected the incoming formation at a distance of 120 miles. Within minutes, every ship in Pearl Harbor was at general quarters. Shore-based fighter squadrons scrambled to intercept, and anti-aircraft batteries were fully manned and ready. The harbor was still shrouded in darkness as the Japanese aircraft approached, but unlike December 7th, there was no element of surprise. Every gun was manned, every searchlight ready. As the first enemy planes came within range, the sky erupted with anti-aircraft fire. Tracers crisscrossed the darkness, creating a lethal web of fire that the Japanese pilots had to navigate. As the Japanese aircraft approached, they flew into a wall of fire. Night fighter tactics, which American pilots had been practicing since January as part of the early readiness doctrine, proved devastatingly effective. Of the 63 Japanese aircraft that approached Oahu that morning, 29 were shot down before they could release their weapons. The remainder jettisoned their bombs and torpedoes prematurely, causing minimal damage to outlying facilities. A Zero pilot who survived the raid would later report, "We expected to find the Americans as we left them in December, asleep. Instead, it was as if they had been waiting for us, guns ready, fighters in the air. It was a trap." By 7:15, the surviving Japanese aircraft were in full retreat, pursued by American fighters that claimed 7 more before they could reach the safety of their carriers. The Japanese strike commander, Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, would later report to Admiral Yamamoto, "The Americans were fully prepared, they knew we were coming. It was as if they had been waiting for us since before dawn." Indeed, they had been. The Japanese carriers, realizing their strike had failed and fearing an American counterattack, withdrew at maximum speed. They had lost more than half their aircraft for negligible damage to American facilities, a devastating exchange rate that they could ill afford as they prepared for the larger engagement at Midway. When Admiral Nimitz received the after-action report, he gathered his senior staff once again. The mood in the conference room was markedly different from previous meetings. There was a quiet confidence that had been absent in the weeks following Pearl Harbor. "This is why we wake up at 4:30, gentlemen," he said quietly. 21 American lives were lost today, and that's 21 too many. But compare that to the 2,403 we lost on December 7th. The Admiral's early relay policy had passed its first true combat test. The Japanese, expecting to achieve surprise just as they had in December, instead flew into a fully prepared defense. The psychological impact on Japanese naval planners was profound. They had lost the element of surprise, one of their most critical tactical advantages. As news of the failed Japanese raid spread throughout the fleet, the grumbling about the early wake-up call virtually disappeared. Sailors now understood that those extra hours of alertness before dawn were not a capricious hardship imposed by an out-of-touch admiral, but rather a life-saving necessity in a war against an enemy that preferred to strike at first light. Aboard the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown, preparing for what would become the Battle of Midway, Chief Petty Officer Thomas Brennan gathered his damage control team for their pre-dawn briefing at 4:45. The veteran sailor had been in the Navy for 15 years and had initially been among the skeptics of Nimitz's early reveille policy. "You boys remember when we used to complain about this ungodly hour?" he asked with a wry smile. "Well, our friends in Pearl are alive today because they were wide awake when the Japanese came calling. Keep that in mind when your alarm goes off tomorrow morning." The men nodded, their faces serious in the dim light of the damage control station. They had heard about the failed Japanese raid. Some had friends stationed at Pearl who had written to them about the experience. The abstract concept of readiness had been transformed into a concrete reality, the difference between life and death. On the bridge of the USS Yorktown, Captain Elliot Buckmaster reviewed the ship's dawn readiness procedures with his executive officer. "I want all hands at general quarters before first light," he instructed. "Combat air patrol launching at 0500, anti-aircraft crews at full manning, radar at maximum sensitivity." The executive officer nodded. "The men have been drilling on this routine for months, Captain. They could do it in their sleep." Buckmaster smiled grimly. "That's rather the point, isn't it, Commander? They won't be asleep. Not at 4:30, not at dawn, not when the enemy expects them to be." The early reveille policy would reach its ultimate vindication at the Battle of Midway in early June 1942. Thanks to Commander Rochefort's code breakers, who had been working relentlessly since January to break Japanese naval communications, Admiral Nimitz knew the enemy's plans in advance. He positioned his 3 available aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway Atoll, ready to ambush the approaching Japanese fleet. The pre-dawn hours of June 4th found the American carriers at their highest state of readiness. Crews had been awake since 4:30, preparing aircraft, manning radar stations, and readying damage control equipment. Pilots had been briefed and were standing by their aircraft. The ships themselves maintained strict radio silence, their presence unknown to the approaching Japanese fleet. What followed was one of the most decisive naval battles in history. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese aircraft struck Midway Island at dawn, exactly as anticipated. While the Japanese carriers were recovering their first strike wave and preparing a second attack against what they believed were non-existent American carriers, dive bombers from the USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown appeared overhead. In just 5 minutes of combat, 3 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were transformed into flaming wrecks. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, was sunk later that day. The Japanese lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots, and the strategic initiative in the Pacific War. The turning point had come, and it had been enabled in part by the heightened state of readiness that Admiral Nimitz had instilled throughout his command since January 7th. In the after-action reports from Midway, commanding officers repeatedly cited the value of pre-dawn readiness in contributing to the victory. The American carriers had launched their aircraft precisely at the optimal moment, a feat of timing that required every man to be at his station and fully prepared well before daybreak. The lessons learned from months of 4:30 reveilles had created a fleet capable of executing complex operations during the critical dawn hours when carrier warfare was often decided. Following the American victory at Midway, Nimitz modified but did not abandon the early Repelling policy. As the Pacific Fleet transitioned from defensive to offensive operations, the 4:30 wake-up call remained standard procedure for ships operating in potential combat zones. Even as new vessels and fresh crews arrived from the United States to join the expanding Pacific Fleet, they quickly adapted to the early morning routine that had become a defining characteristic of Nimitz's command philosophy. By 1943, as American forces began the long island-hopping campaign toward Japan, the early Repelling had evolved into a comprehensive doctrine of combat readiness. Ships maintained Condition 2 status from 4:30 until full daylight. Dawn and dusk fighter patrols became standard procedure for carrier task forces. Radar operators worked in shorter shifts to maintain peak alertness during critical hours. The policy's impact extended beyond tactical readiness. It created a mindset of vigilance and discipline that permeated the entire Pacific Fleet. As one junior officer noted in his diary, "There's something about starting each day in the darkness, prepared for combat, that changes how you think about everything else." The Admiral's 4:30 wake-up call taught us that, in war, there are no safe moments, no times when vigilance can be relaxed. This cultural shift proved as important as the tactical benefits. The Pacific Fleet had transformed from a peacetime organization caught unprepared by a surprise attack into a combat-ready force that anticipated threats before they materialized. This transformation was reflected in countless small ways, from the meticulous attention to equipment maintenance to the thorough briefings before operations to the constant training for emergency scenarios. But it all began with that simple, controversial decision to wake every sailor at 4:30 in the morning. Japanese naval commanders eventually adapted their tactics in response to the Americans' heightened state of readiness. They abandoned dawn raids in favor of night torpedo attacks by destroyers and submarines. But these, too, encountered American forces already at general quarters, with radar scanning and sonar pinging in the pre-dawn darkness. During the Battle of Guadalcanal, Japanese attempts at night surface actions initially caught American forces off guard. Admiral Nimitz responded by extending the early Repelling concept to create specialized night fighting units. Ships assigned to these duties maintained peak readiness during night hours, with crews adjusting their sleep schedules accordingly. The lessons learned from the early morning readiness doctrine proved adaptable to the evolving tactical situation. As the war progressed and American industrial might produced an overwhelming advantage in ships, aircraft, and weapons, the early Repelling policy might have seemed less necessary. Yet Admiral Nimitz maintained the practice throughout his command. Even as victory became increasingly certain, he refused to allow complacency to creep back into the fleet's operations. "The moment we decide the enemy can no longer hurt us is the moment we become vulnerable," he told a gathering of newly arrived ship captains in early 1945. The assembled officers, many fresh from the Naval Academy or Officer Candidate School, listened attentively as the Admiral continued. "The 4:30 Repelling isn't about specific tactics anymore. It's about maintaining the mindset that has brought us this far: vigilance, readiness, and the willingness to sacrifice comfort for survival." One young lieutenant raised his hand. "Admiral, with respect, our forces now outnumber the Japanese by more than 5-1. Their navy is largely destroyed. Is the early Repelling still necessary?" Nimitz regarded the young officer thoughtfully. "Lieutenant, how many men died at Pearl Harbor?" 2,403, sir," the lieutenant replied promptly. "And how many ships were lost or damaged?" 18, sir," Nimitz nodded. "And that near-fatal blow was delivered by an enemy we knew was hostile, at a time when war was considered imminent. Yet we were not ready." He paused, letting the words sink in. Now imagine how much more dangerous complacency would be today, when victory seems assured and men begin to think about going home. That, Lieutenant, is why the 4:30 Repelling remains as important as ever. In the final months of the war, as American forces closed in on Japan itself, The early wake-up policy that had begun as a response to Pearl Harbor had become so ingrained in fleet operations that most sailors could hardly imagine beginning their day any other way. What had once seemed an arbitrary hardship had transformed into a defining characteristic of the Pacific Fleet's operational culture. When Japan finally surrendered on September 2, 1945, Admiral Nimitz stood on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay to accept the formal capitulation. Few of those present that day made the connection between this moment of triumph and the seemingly small decision Nimitz had made in January 1942 to wake his sailors before dawn. Yet the path from disaster to victory had begun with that single change in routine, a change that had transformed a defeated fleet into the most formidable naval force in history. In the years following the war, as naval operations returned to peacetime patterns, the 430 Repelling was gradually relaxed. Ships in port resumed more conventional schedules, and the strict pre-dawn readiness requirements were reserved for vessels operating in potential conflict zones. Yet the principle behind Nimitz's early morning policy, that readiness before dawn prevents surprise attacks, became permanently embedded in United States Navy doctrine. Today, more than 8 decades after Pearl Harbor, American naval vessels still maintain their highest alert status during the hours before dawn when operating in contested waters. Modern sailors, checking their sophisticated electronic warfare systems in the pre-dawn darkness, might not know the origin of this practice. They might not realize that their early wake-up call traces directly back to a decision made by Admiral Chester Nimitz in the aftermath of the greatest disaster in American naval history. Yet the legacy endures. In naval academies and war colleges, Nimitz's decision to implement the 430 Repelling is studied as a classic example of how a seemingly small change in operational routine can yield strategic advantages. Military historians point to it as evidence of Nimitz's genius for understanding both the psychological and tactical dimensions of naval warfare. Admiral Chester Nimitz passed away on February 20, 1966, at the age of 80. Among his many accomplishments, the victory at Midway, the island-hopping campaign, the development of carrier warfare, few speak of his early Repelling policy. It was not the kind of dramatic decision that makes headlines or features prominently in history books. Yet for the thousands of American sailors who survived the Pacific War because they were awake, alert, and ready for combat when the enemy came calling at dawn, that simple command, Repelling at 0430, made all the difference between defeat and victory, between life and death. When Nimitz was asked after the war about his most important decisions as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, he rarely mentioned the early Repelling policy. He spoke instead of the major strategic choices, the defense of Midway, the bypass of Rabaul, the Leyte Gulf landing. But those who served closely with him understood that the foundation for all those successes had been laid in January 1942, with that first controversial order that transformed the fleet's entire approach to readiness. The true measure of leadership, Nimitz once observed, is not found in grand strategies, but in the small decisions that shape an organization's culture. No decision better illustrated this philosophy than his insistence on the 430 Repelling, a small change with enormous implications. As we reflect on the decisions that shaped the outcome of World War II, we are often drawn to the grand strategies and major battles. But sometimes victory hinges on the smallest details, like what time sailors wake up in the morning. Admiral Nimitz understood this fundamental truth that wars are won not just by superior weapons or tactics, but by the willingness to sacrifice comfort for readiness, to choose vigilance over complacency, to be awake when the enemy expects you to be asleep. In his personal journal, discovered among his papers after his death, Nimitz had written a reflection on leadership dated June 5, 1942, the day after the American victory at Midway. The most consequential decisions, he noted, are often those that seem inconsequential at the time. When I ordered the fleet to begin its day at 4:30, I faced significant resistance. Yet that single change in routine may have saved more American lives than any weapon system we deployed. Perhaps that is the most profound lesson of Nimitz's 4:30 Réveillé, that leadership sometimes requires making unpopular decisions whose value will only become apparent in retrospect. The admiral had the foresight to see what others could not, that in the dark hours before dawn, the fate of nations might be decided by whether sailors were asleep in their bunks or awake at their battle stations. Would you have made the same decision if you were in Admiral Nimitz's position? Would you have demanded that thousands of tired sailors sacrifice 2 hours of sleep every day for years on end? Or would you have sought a more comfortable middle ground, perhaps implementing heightened readiness only during periods of specific threat? The choices leaders make in war are rarely easy, and their consequences extend far beyond the immediate moment. Admiral Nimitz's 4:30 Réveillé reminds us that sometimes victory depends not on dramatic gestures, but on the quiet discipline of being ready before dawn every single day, until the battle is won. Comment below and share this story, so others remember what courage really means, not just the courage to face the enemy in battle, but the courage to make difficult, unpopular decisions that ultimately save lives and win wars.